From an early age, my dad wanted to preach. Despite the poor circumstances of growing up on an Arkansas farm, he went to Harding College to prepare for ministry. There he met a girl from South Texas who became his wife and my mother. In the early years of his working life, he taught school and preached as well. He then moved to a congregation where his only job was that of being a preacher. Over the next several years, he was invited to preach at congregations that were larger. I suppose he was in his 50s when things changed. He was looking for a new ministry, but the larger congregations were no longer interested. Like many other preachers, one factor of success in ministry that Dad considered was the size of the congregation where one preached. About the time my dad was facing this change in his ministry, I was in my first work as a full-time preacher. Debbie and I, along with another couple, had decided to start a new congregation in Virginia, where churches of Christ were few and those in existence were often small. We met in rented quarters at first, and yes, our numbers were small. I decided to write my dad a letter. I made the case that success in ministry was not determined by the size of the congregation. I hope the advice from a wet behind the ears young preacher helped. At any rate, my dad became the preacher for a smaller congregation and had a good ministry for over a decade. What determines success in preaching? Is it a big congregation, a large radio or television ministry, or invitations to speak at lectureships and revivals? Even Jesus was faced with decisions about what determines success in preaching. His example gives guidance to preachers in all times and all places. Our text today tells how Jesus handled the challenges of ministry. Charles Erdman wrote, "Nothing could illustrate better the rapid movement and active energy which characterize the Gospel of Mark than to look back over the contents of this first chapter, which to look back over within the compass of just a few verses has recorded a succession of events almost bewildering in number, including the preaching of John, the baptism and temptation of Jesus, the call of the disciples, and the incidents of the busy Sabbath in Capernaum. The following day is a sharp contrast. Jesus found a place to be alone. 10 occasions are recorded in the Gospels where Jesus withdrew from the public. At times, he even retreated from his apostles to be alone in prayer to his Father. Read with me from our text this morning, Mark chapter 1, verses 35 through 45. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." Jesus replied, "Let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come." So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Filled with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cured. Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. "See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere. We see first in our text a time to pray, verse 35. Jesus had just concluded a very busy day, a very successful day in ministry there in Capernaum. He had spoke in the synagogue, he had cast out a demon, he had healed Peter's mother-in-law from a fever. As the Sabbath ended, people came in droves to be healed, and Jesus healed many. But now it is the next day, and very early in the morning, probably everybody else was still snoozing. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up. He left the house, and he went out and found a secluded place, a solitary place, a place where he could be alone, so that he could pray to his Father. Mark in his gospel records 3 specific times that Jesus spent in prayer, here and in chapter 6 and chapter 14. These times of prayer all occurred at night, or at least when it was dark, and they seem to have all occurred during times of tension. Jesus prayed, and his prayer was good preparation for preaching. The humanity of Jesus shows itself in his need for prayer. He needed to be spiritually refreshed. Earl McMillan said, Jesus approached his Father as an obedient son in need of blessing. If Jesus needed to spend time in prayer, how much more do we need to do so? Albert Barnes said, he that wishes to enjoy religion will seek a place of private prayer in the morning. If that is omitted, all will go wrong, our piety will wither, the world will fill our thoughts. Well, I don't know the time of day is the most crucial thing. Some of us are not morning people. But we need to set aside a time to pray. It is important that we be regular in prayer. We need to find a quiet place for prayer that is helpful. In my first ministry, we had purchased a building, renovated it. One of the men in the congregation was named David Young, and he would talk about during his lunch hour going over to the church building to pray. And I thought at the time, well, you know, you don't really have to go into a church to pray. But it wasn't that he considered that to be a holy place. It was a quiet place. He left all the noise of his office where he worked. Even going home might be a little disruptive. His wife might want to talk to him, you know. But he would go and find a quiet place and pray. Jesus sought out a quiet place. He spent time in prayer. If Jesus needed to pray to his Father, certainly we do. Well, Jesus is not there for very long, it seems, until he's interrupted. That brings us to our next point, a time to preach. Simon and his companions didn't see Jesus in the house. They went looking for him. They found him. And they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." Yes, Jesus, in his prayer, in his relationship with his Father there, one-on-one, was interrupted. Alan Coe described it this way: the earliness of the hour and the pains thus constantly taken to secure a quiet place for uninterrupted prayer left an abiding impression on the disciples. Simon, at least, thoroughly disapproved of the Lord's unrealistic strategy of withdrawing from the bustle and opportunity of Capernaum to the silence of the lonely spot. He must have been still more puzzled when Christ saw, in his heightened local interest, roused by his healing work, the signal to move on and to preach in other villages. Now, here is Peter saying to Jesus, you know, everybody's looking for you. What are you doing out here, basically? Jesus, on the other hand, yes, he knew of the great success of the previous day, how that droves of people came to be healed. He knew of his popularity. But Jesus says, we don't need to stay here. We need to go somewhere else. We need to go to the nearby villages so that I can preach there also. He says, that is why I have come. And so Mark tells us he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. Yes, he continued to do the miraculous. Mark emphasizes the casting out of demons. The miracles were to confirm that he was indeed the Son of God, that he was the messenger. But his task, his main task, was not to heal, but to preach. In two places in Mark, Jesus, in the first person, directly states his purpose on earth. He does that here in our text, also in chapter 2, verse 17. Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Jesus knew that he should be preaching. That is what he came to do. He came to preach, and he would carry out the ultimate part of that preaching by making his message the good news as he went to the cross and then was raised from the dead. Wendell Willis said Jesus' power was not confined to any particular locality or to one type of healing. Jesus described his mission as coming to preach. But in practice, this preaching was largely done by healing. I think Willis makes a good point there. But we notice that Jesus' emphasis was on what he said. Mark in his gospel emphasizes the deeds, the miracles. It is the gospel of power, of action. But those miracles were not ends in themselves. They were to make one more open to the message. I have a memory from the first day of a class I took on how to prepare sermons. The professor asked us, each of us, why we were in the class. My memory, for what it's worth, is that I answered perhaps more enthusiastically than I realized. When it came my turn to say why I was in the class, I said, "I want to preach." The professor replied, "Well, then get up and preach." It seems that laughter erupted at my expense. Well, I was there because I wanted to preach and I wanted to prepare to preach. And as I think about ministry, there are many good things a preacher can do. These days, we can't heal people. That was something Jesus and the early apostles could do. But we can minister in many different ways. On the other hand, we must never forget that our most important task is to preach the gospel. That requires some preparation time. It must not be the last thing we do, but the primary thing we do. We have the great example of Jesus. He came to preach. We also see in our text a time to heal. The fourth instance in Mark of healing concerns a leper. Only two characters are involved in this event. The first is an untouchable, unconscious of his own state, earnestly desiring to be cleansed, humble enough to ask for cleansing, and believing that the Christ had power to heal him. The other figure is the compassionate Christ, who does not shrink from laying his hand even on the loathsomeness of leprosy. Due to his leprosy, this man could not participate in the formal religious worship of the day. The term leper in Scripture is broader than in its modern usage, that is Hansen's disease. But the man did have a skin disease that put him in a pitiful state and caused him to be socially ostracized. The leper came to Jesus. This indicates that he knew of Jesus as a healer. He showed trust. He says, "If you will, you can heal me." This may have been the most emotional event of Jesus' healings. The leper begged and fell on his knees. Jesus had compassion upon the man when he made the request. And of all things, Jesus touched him. Now, a good Jew did not touch someone who was unclean. That made him unclean. But Jesus touched. There are two other references in Mark's gospel to Jesus touched or being touched. Sometimes he touched the person, sometimes they reached out and touched him. And Jesus touched this leper, and the cure was immediate and complete. Well, for about a year, we've been encouraged not to touch. We never did much practice the holy kiss, but we used to talk about the holy handshake or the holy hug. And then they told us we shouldn't do that, and so it became the holy wave or the holy elbow bump. Well, that advice would apply really anytime we think we might be sick. We shouldn't risk spreading it to others by contact with them. But you know, touch is important. During this last year, there have been thousands of individuals who have touched those who were sick. Yes, they wore the personal protection, but they were the ones who were available there in the hospitals, giving that touch to one who was sick. When AIDS became widespread, it was often Christians who said, well, despite this disease and the horrors of this disease, I'm going to touch those who have this disease to show them that they are loved. In past epidemics, it has often been Christians who at risk to themselves took care of those who were sick, including the necessity of touching them. Touch is important. Debbie's mother is my third mama. She took me in years ago. You better not badmouth me in front of my mother-in-law. We went for over a month without being able to see her. Now she's back home and we've been able to visit with her. And I hold her hand to show love and concern for her. I always try to remember to wash them first, I think. But when one is ill, when one is just spiritually ill, or maybe that's spiritually ill, they need someone to reach out and touch them. Jesus touched a leper. Well, Jesus gave instructions to the leper. He says, you need to go and show yourself to the priest. There are certain things you had to do if you had an uncleanness. You needed to go, and the priest was the one who would pronounce that you were well. Jesus also said, don't tell anybody about this. Now, we find that a little strange, don't we? We have been very much in the age where preachers want everybody to know about their ministry. They want to attract attention, attract the crowds. Well, that's really nothing new. The disciples of Jesus wanted him to continue to attract the crowds. That wasn't what Jesus was here for. So he told the man, don't tell anybody. Well, the man may have had good intentions. He didn't do what Jesus said. He went out and told everybody about it. But it actually interfered with the ministry of Jesus. Soon, Jesus could no longer go to town. He was very much the celebrity. If he showed up, people surrounded him. And so he did basically as John the Baptist had done in his ministry. He went out to the wilderness. Folks came out to him. in large numbers. Warren Wiersbe made an interesting comment on this text. He said, Jesus told this man to keep quiet, and yet he told everybody. Jesus commands us to tell everybody, and we keep quiet. The leper disobeyed Jesus. We should not disobey Jesus. We should tell about him. Well, Jesus knew the importance of prayer. Jesus knew the meaning of successful preaching. We see Jesus' compassion in the healing of the leper. Why did Jesus come? We see why he came in this text today. From an early age, I wanted to be a preacher. My dad and mother encouraged me to preach. While I was in graduate school, I determined to do mission work. Debbie supported me. She had followed me far from Texas to Memphis for graduate school. She followed me even farther as we moved to Virginia. Her good mother didn't like that her baby girl was so far away, but she too was supportive. The first congregation where we served was small. We had growth. People were brought to Jesus. The subsequent congregations have also been small. The largest congregation I served had about 80 on Sunday morning attendance. But God has used us in these small congregations. I've had occasions to preach to audiences of several hundred people. Over the years, I've interviewed with congregations of several hundred members. Preaching to crowds is good for the ego. But the ego is not the correct motivation for ministry. Small congregations need preachers too. I pretty much decided that I'm not ever going to be the preacher for a congregation of 500 people. And you know, that's probably okay at this point. But I'm going to preach where God wants me, as long as he wants me there. And you see, Jesus is my example and must be my example of successful ministry. He wasn't swayed by the thoughts of popularity. He did what he came to do.